Hello everybody. All right, today I'm going to talk with you and paint, but the topic, I suppose, the overarching topic today is sketchbooks. If any of you have studied with me, taken any of my live courses, or are a member of my online course with Terracotta, my mentorship course with Terracotta, I talk a lot about the value of a sketchbook. That's a huge topic in itself, but I just want to glance on it today. But going everywhere with the sketchbook, I have sketchbooks I carry with me that I have by my bedside, under every piece of furniture I own. And what they are for me is a visual recording device, sort of a visual diary, if you will. So whenever anything occurs to me that I see that I'm fascinated with, or that I think of, or I remember, or that perhaps I imagine, or if I hear something that makes me happy or unhappy, in visual form in my sketchbook, to just record my experiences. Yes, it can be things that I see. Well, in this case, it's just something I'm designing, imagining, dreaming up, and I'll do a quicker sketch, and then I'll do alterations, and I'll develop it. I think I can say I can draw pretty well. These are not intended to be good drawings. These are really scrappy developmental sketch ideas. And what this does, it sort of locks in place ideas, things that jump to mind, that they're not always the genesis of a painting. They can just be things that occur to me, and that maybe I can use them as paintings later on down the road. So anyway, the topic for today is centered around this sketchbook. I recently moved into a new studio, and in moving all of my stuff, I found all these boxes of ancient sketchbooks. This one fell out, and it was from a trip I took to Greece. Gosh, I don't even know what year, but many years ago, at least 30, probably pushing 40 years ago. And I've been to Greece a number of times. I love it, but this particular trip was centered around the Peloponnesian Peninsula. Most people, when they go to Greece, naturally and understandably, they might go to Athens, which is a great city, and probably the islands, Mykonos, Santorini, etc., all great. But off to the west, the Peloponnese, Olympia, Corinth, all these beautiful towns and countryside are almost littered with Greek and Roman ruins. And just history everywhere. I of course, love it. In the days I went, a lot of these sites, well, they're obviously there. They were discovered, of course, but they weren't quite as protected as may be the case now. And you could walk right up to them, sit on them, and touch them, and they're a little harder to do that nowadays. In my terracotta class the other day, I developed this sketch, which was the Temple of Zeus near Olympia. And it's just a beautiful, almost abstract collection of shapes and forms. In those days, I was able to just go up and sit on it and touch it. And obviously, the whole idea of connection through time. This was built roughly 500 BC, so 2,500 years ago, and you could see all the thinking that must have gone into this, the planning, the handiwork, the craftsmanship. It's overwhelmingly beautiful and impressive. Today, however, I want to work on this smaller sketch at the top of this page. The point of keeping sketches for a long time is, when I did these, when I do a lot of my sketches, I don't necessarily think of that I'm going to develop them into paintings. I might, but some I just do because I want to record what I look at, yes, but more what I see. By that I mean, what was my feeling? What was my experience? What was my impression? What was it about this place that made me want to spend a few minutes and draw it? This is the Temple Epicurius Apollo from Bassae, which is somewhat near Olympia as well in the western part of Greece. It's vague, but slightly newer than the Temple of Zeus. It's roughly 400 to 450 BC, so still incredibly old. What's remarkable about this temple is a lot, but much of it is still intact. It was fairly undisturbed for centuries. So a lot of it is still standing, even though it's 2,500 years old. So yeah, very impressive. I emphasize in my classes and in my life the importance of keeping sketches and sketchbooks, yes, but then later on, if you do decide to develop one as a painting or maybe a more finished drawing, you have a record of it. And I think in many, many ways, the visual sketch record is more valuable to me than a reference photo may be. I urge myself and my students to draw less from reference photos whenever possible and more from your sketches. I just think the sketches are a more accurate, true, authentic record of your emotions, your experiences, your impressions. A reference photo, nothing wrong with them, except they're a bit limiting. They're going to capture what somebody else cropped, or if you took it yourself even, it's going to capture the visual specifics of a place, but it may not be as effective as capturing the emotional impact as a sketch would be. So anyway, I do use reference photos, but I always urge myself and others to become a little less reliant on them and a little bit more reliant on painting directly from your sketches, and it's a little bit like taking the training wheels off, just becoming more trusting of your own instincts and your own creative voice. All right, so I'm just going to sketch this up. It's a tiny little sketch that I did, so I'm going to do it slightly bigger. It's not a huge painting I intend to do, but it's about a quarter sheet. So not tiny, but not very big. I'm going to draw it completely from memory, even though it's an old memory, and from my sketch. And it's just a great way for me to connect with a younger version of myself, for sure, but also the whole idea of paying homage to a place like this is just respecting the passing of time, the vast span of time. I know it's not a new idea, of course, but it's just a very moving one nonetheless. This was a massive temple. It covered a huge area when it was completely intact. And it's remarkable architecturally or culturally for a few reasons. There was a rectangle of columns all around the exterior of it, banding the exterior of the temple, all in the very rigid, purist Doric style. Within the temple, as I understand it, newer or other architectural orders, I believe one of the first uses of the Corinthian capital were seen, etc. And it was highly ornamented and decorated on the interior when it was new. You cannot walk up to this temple anymore, I don't believe. It was designated a UNESCO heritage site, as it should have been, but it's very protected now. It's under a structure. Over the years since I was last there, renovation or restoration has continued and excavation, so the whole temple is still very impressive, but it's under an enclosure, like a large semi-permanent tent structure outside, which is fine. It's all to the good, but it's a little less romantic, I suppose, than just being able to walk up to it in the wild as I did and sit on it and crawl all over it. Technically, what I'm drawing with is my favorite sketch pencil, these Palomino pencils by Blackwing. This is a 602 medium softness, fairly soft pencil, but just a gorgeous sketch pencil. And I'm working on a piece of watercolor paper. This is Baohong Master's Choice 140 pound or 300 gram rough surface. I love playing around with different paper surfaces just to achieve different effects, but I just love this paper. It has a fairly light amount of sizing, so it's somewhat softer in a way, but in part because of that, it's very pure and white, very crystalline white. So I thought for these white marble columns and the brightness I want to try to maintain in part of the painting I hope to do, the whitest paper possible might be good. I'm not sure it's the only choice for this sketch. I could see doing this on even softer paper like a Saunders or something like that with a very soft finish. I have a kind of overall look in mind that I want the final painting to do. This very textured paper is kind of good for showing patina and texture, and this whole thing I love to do with implying architectural detail without actually showing that much of it, and textured paper helps me do that. As always, I start off with my horizon line. That's not the line where everything stops, but it's the line that bisects your visual field, meaning there's visual information above, visual information below. I have lowered the horizon a bit so that I can look up at the structure a bit more than if I had a more standard horizon cutting right through. I want to emphasize sort of the drama of the height of this temple. So I've lowered the horizon a bit so that we look up at it. I'm working with a 2-point perspective. 1 point is fairly locatable or visible on the page, right on the horizon line there. The second vanishing point would be way out into space. There's no need to locate it when you're sketching. It's just good to keep it in your mind's eye as where more or less it is, and yeah, it's a sketch. If I was doing a very tight formal drawing, there might be some value in really trying to locate it, but for a relatively quick and impressionistic sketch, an approximation is generally good enough. So I do remember being there. It really was quite large. I showed a part of a corner of the temple that was a little smaller, so it emphasized more the verticality rather than the horizontality of the entire structure. And so I want to try to be true to my initial 40-year-old impressions and recreate that here. You get a sense of the inner chamber a bit through this outer ring of Doric columns. It really was a quick sketch, so I didn't give myself much to go on. But that's all right, that's the idea. Very much intact with the plinth or the base upon which it sits. with this elegant stairway all around the temple. 3 and 4 steps, marble steps up. So visually, this does end almost at the horizon. I don't want that to be the case, so what I'm going to do is populate the foreground with some remnants of antiquity. I've hinted in the sketch at some of the rubble bits of columns and lintels that may have fallen off. So I'm going to use that as a starting point and just extrapolate and invent or try to remember some others. I do want to connect the sky to the structure, to the land. So I want to connect foreground, midground, background. So I want to lap over the stairway that I've started with just some bits of architecture that may have fallen off over time. Again, I have no photo reference or anything other than my memory, but I think that's all right. It's just an implication of these things. I do want to work a little bit of grass. I think sort of an unkept olive green weaving up to the temple, interspersed with some earth showing through, and of course these marble elements that might be laying all about. I do recall a number of these column segments were on the ground. So big slices of these Doric columns. I just found that so impressive because each segment, each slice was immense. It's just hard for me to imagine the amount of work and the precision with which they were created. Obviously, they didn't have power tools either to create them or to put them in place. And the precision, even after many hundreds of years, of what is remaining of this temple, it's just astounding. So seeing these bits and pieces up close, really to me quite moving. As a painter, I'm very interested in, I guess what I'm saying is the one consistent idea through all of my work, my key, my way in, I like to call it, to whatever it is I'm drawing or painting, is this idea of contrast. I don't just mean light versus dark, though that's one example, but I mean vertical energies versus horizontal energies, warm tones in the painting versus cool tones. And then, more, I don't want to say abstract, but maybe more philosophical ideas. Time, the past versus the present, or even the future, if you get into purely fictional elements or imagined scenes, which I love to do too. If any of you follow my work, I am a big fan of completely fictional scenes, cities. I just love to play around with this whole idea of time, what it was, what it is, what it may be, and how we as human beings react to it. I think what I'm going to try to do, I'm just sort of inventing this as I go. I don't want to make too big of a deal out of it, but I want to invent a sort of subtle pathway, a visual path up to the temple. Is this accurate? No, most likely not. So I'm going to just save this without too much of this beautiful antique rubble sitting around. And then that way I can play around with some of the warm and cool tones and hopefully make sort of a visual path that will lead the viewer of this right up to it. But again, I want it subtle and a bit understated, so I don't want to hammer it too heavily. I did a painting a while ago of, I don't know, something in the Roman Forum. And there were all these bits of columns, capitals, walls, beautiful, priceless antiquities laying all over the ground. And my nephews saw it and said, it's cool, I guess, but why don't they clean up the yard? Because the grassy area in front of the temple was just littered with priceless antiques, which he thought was just the equivalent of abandoned tires or old refrigerators or something. Anyway, adorable. So I'm gonna junk up the yard a little bit. As I get down here, a little away from the center of focus, which will be here, I'll become a little more impressionistic, sketchy, and loose about this stuff. I'm getting a little nervous. I'm spending too much time down here, and I want it to be really quite loose and impressionistic. I think a few of these historic elements should be more than enough to visually connect to the temple itself, and this is the star of the show, so I don't want to compete with it too much here. All right, I'll reference my old sketch again. I showed additional columns here in the distance, which I like. I think it's a nice assembly. So we can continue this line down to the horizon and then just lightly lay in some additional columns here in the distance. I may make some changes to I'll redesign my memory there a little bit. If you'll see, I have two columns showing here and two there. Maybe that's what it really was, but I think it'd be a little more elegant if there was one or three counter juxtaposed to two. Just nicer overall, more harmonious composition. So I don't think you ever have to be too locked into either what you see or what you remember, or just never be afraid to redesign your drawings if you think it'll result in a better painting. And these are light and in the distance, so I'm just going to suggest 3 additional of these Doric columns in the distance. All right, that's good enough. I get asked a lot if I use straight edges to set up my drawings. Yes, sometimes I do. But when I'm doing what I hope this will be is a pretty fluid, organic looking sketch, if I'm doing a very large drawing and I want to make sure there's some accuracy to it, yes, I may use a straight edge to lightly establish some dominant verticals or perspective lines, but then I will freehand next to them just so it doesn't look too tight or start to imply that it's a technical drawing that I love technical drawings, but they can look obviously a little dry, a little medicinal, and more reliant on technique than expression, and that is not what I want here. So I'm doing this all freehand. It's not that hard. There's just not much here to, and if things are a little scrappy and irregular, well, after all, the subject is 2,500 years old, so it has some miles on it. I know what that's like. What I'm less sure about, graphically or in terms of a finished image, is how 40 years ago I terminated the sketch on the right. I indicated another column here and then just let it fade. Not that that's bad, but I think it may not suit me well for a slightly more finished sketch that I'm trying to do. So I think similarly to the way I redesigned the distant columns, I'm going to redesign the nearer column too, just to make what I hope will be a better image. So to that end, I think what I'll do is indicate a third column here along the so-called front facade, but instead of making it climb all the way up, I'll just give it one of those romantic looking architectural ruined devices where the top of the column just fell off and ended up down here somehow. And I think that's going to be a slightly more elegant, more simple way to terminate this drawing, and then I will just let it fade from there. Yeah, that's not bad. I do remember, but also I indicated here some of the horizontal banding of these segments was visible, and I surely do not want to show them all, but a few or a couple. I think that's good just to make it feel a little more authentic. In fact, though, they'd be much thinner than that, but again, can't be too chained to absolute accuracy. It's just the impression of it being hand-built and segmented and piled up one thing on top of the other. All amazingly fit together, obviously without mortar. Concrete didn't exist till much later. So these were, they had these square holes in the middle of each of these cylindrical segments. So wooden pilings went through, presumably, and that's what kept these partially in place, but it also was a function of just how precisely they were cut and fit together. So no mortar, and hundreds of years later, they're still standing. Now we're getting into an area I know well, which is the conflict between drawing and painting. I love to draw, and that's all well and good, but if you're doing an undersketch that you're going to watercolor over, it's not always good to draw too much. Again, it can begin to threaten your eventual painting and make it look a little paint by number, or sort of filling in the blanks, and you just find yourself painting a lot tighter and more rigidly. So I have to police myself and keep myself from overdrawing my base drawings, and just indicate the main shapes and then allow the brush to fill in the rest. So here I'm starting to draw in some indication of the stonework in this back wall, which true is there, but I don't think I need to show much. I think with my paintbrush I can really indicate most of that character. So most things are more or less addressed. The background, what's seen behind, what's necessary, what will help, what will hurt, what's too much, what's not enough. I think the overall aesthetic of this painting is we're standing down on the pathway looking up slightly up a hill, so that the horizon falls more toward the lower part. This temple is up slightly on a rise, so we're looking up at this, which means there's this overall vertical narrative that I like and want to maintain. So the format of my page I'm feeling like perhaps there's just too much sky showing. I may want to crop it off there. Obviously, I want some sky above this to set up the visual connection of heaven and earth, if you will, or sky, built environment, landmass. But I don't know if I need all of that sky showing. That's a simple thing to do. I could paint it, and then if I matted it or framed it, if it was worthy of that, that could be done later. But this was pretty much in the countryside, as I recall, not a lot of city or built environment around, so just these rolling hills with olive trees and cypress perhaps showing. All of that's fine, but the thing is, I just don't want to draw anything that's going to detract from the star of the show. So as I'm talking and sketching here, I'm thinking it may be a stronger painting if I show no visual elements in the background at all. I may do a very quick study on what I want the final painting to look like as far as location of value and color. So, vertical format. Looking up at this temple. I'm thinking in my mind's eye of a sky. That grades from light at the top of the image to slightly darker, hugging the temple on either side. So probably a yellowish sky that grades down into violet. So it looks a bit like a later in the day point of view. I say that because if well done, it should look fairly romantic, but also quiet the painting down, make it look a little less like a tourist view, I think, is what I'm getting at. Whereas if I just did a typical bright blue sky, nothing wrong with that. But I just think for this, I want a slightly more dramatic feel overall. Then I think what I'll do is darken the top of the elements of the lintels, these marble columns at the top, only so they silhouette nicely against the sky. And then as they come down, allow the bottoms of the columns, walls, the temple in general, to be lighter. I build up all of my works with 3 basic values in mind: light, dark, and mid-tone. And I think it doesn't mean there's no variation. Within darks, there can be darker darks, lighter darks. Mid-tones, there can be quite dark mid-tones and more mid-tone mid-tones and lighter mid-tones. But overall, a design of values, all of which fall into a dark, a mid-tone, or a light, I think is the most effective way to design your work. So I think the lightest light, which I call a 1, will happen here, just at the base of the column, and a little bit on this walkway I'm inventing. So a little bit of light here, fading out, very light at the bottom of the temple. Slightly darker at the top, silhouetting against the sky, slightly darker in the foreground. So a 2 value is the mid-tone. And the darkest darks 3. And those, you have control as the painter for how dark you want your darks to be, of course. But what I think you need to think about is the range of values. How dark should your darks be? If you have a fairly good design of lights, midtones, and darks, you can narrow the range down so that the darkest dark isn't really that dark. But anyway, what I'm getting at is you can orchestrate that. A very wide range of values is going to make a loud, more expressive kind of painting. So a busy cityscape, carnival scenes, lots of activity, that kind of thing. I could imagine a much wider, more color, more contrast, more saturation. If you want to tell a quieter story, which I want to do here, sort of a late in the day, quiet, almost to try to make this painting look like what it is, which is a memory, what I want to do is quiet everything down. So one way to do that is to narrow the value range between dark and light. The lights can still be saved white paper a bit if you wish, which I think I'm going to do, but that means the darks do not have to approach black. They can be sort of a mid-tone in the grayscale, mid-tone, 50-60% perhaps, and you'll still have a dynamic range of values that will tell a quieter, more contemplative or introspective story. Yeah, overall I think this will work. So the lights will be mostly here, the darks here and here and a bit in between. So I'll set up a rhythm, I hope, of dark, light, dark, and then mid-tone, darker mid-tone, darker mid-tone, lighter mid-tone. A nice toggle through the background into the foreground. And that's a fairly simple, but hopefully pretty effective value design. Again, color, I think I'm going to go yellow to violet. And then minimal, but perhaps some violet into teals and olive greens to suggest some of the grasses in the foreground, fading it out to warm, so it'll go slightly warm, cool, warm. That should work. Then I think I'll keep the temple very simple, mostly warm tones, modified ever so slightly, perhaps with cobalt blues, umbers, ochres, slight blues for complement tonality. So a nice limited but warm, cool story should work. Am I going to put human figures in here? No. I think to really get this story across, to make it a kind of a thoughtful, introspective, not somber, I hope, but an introspective feel. I don't want to introduce figures crawling around as if they're tourists. Not that that would be necessarily wrong. I just think it'd be a false note for this work that I want, again, to look more like a memory and not like a scene or a travelogue painting with a bunch of tourists like I was crawling around all over it. So I'm leaving all the people out. If I do it well enough, you should be able to imagine yourself within the scene in some ways that might be compelling. It's always worth thinking about whether you add people, how many, what you want them to be doing. They don't just add scale, they really change the overall flavor of your work and can tell a very different story. So, yeah, obviously any element you put in your painting has an effect on everything else. So I'll put my sketches off to the side and turn to the painting now. I think from here on out, the training wheel's off and I'll just paint this. I imagined most of this. I remembered most of this. So there's really nothing to look at as far as reference. That's okay. Again, I think there's a little bit too much sky. I may tape it down Again, it doesn't really matter. I could crop it off when it's over, but I think it'll be easier for me to see it properly if I get the proportions a little better. So I'm asked a lot how I prepare my paper before I paint. Modern day sizing in watercolor paper sort of precludes the need to stretch it as we used to have to do in the old days. The sizing in the paper is much, in many ways better. It's very different, but yeah, I think this proportion of sky to building looks a little more comfortable now. I do want to leave enough space above for a nice glow in the light sky above, but I think that's better. So large pieces of paper, full sheets or up, I still will, with a sponge or spraying, just add water to the back of the page, flip it upside down, let it expand a little while, and then tape it down to, staple it down to my wooden stretcher boards, and then it dries flat as a drum. And that's just a habit because it's what I always used to do, but it does still help a bit. You have to be careful though with modern paper. A lot of it has, sizing isn't as durable or as rugged as it used to be. So if you wash all the sizing out, you can get into some trouble. Half-size sheets or smaller like this, roughly quarter-size sheets, I don't stretch them per se. I just tape them down dry to a stretcher board, and they're just fine. So what I'm doing here is a very wet, very traditional wash, French wash or graded wash, where you build up this bead of pigment and water and then just pull it down the page with the tip of your brush. First off, I paint on a tilt, an angle. I angle my easel at about a 30-degree slope. If I'm painting outdoors on site, I paint almost vertically. But here, so that things can show more clearly on camera, I've reduced the tilt a little, and yeah, it's still about a 30 degrees. And what that allows me to do then naturally is to use gravity, water running downhill. Surprised you didn't know that. Yeah, gravity. It's a tool we have that they haven't been able to charge us for yet, that can really be our friend. You can tilt your board up if you want more gravity to pull the wash in one direction or another, to get it to run faster or to lay it down slightly flatter. Obviously it will run slower. So transitions, if you're swapping from one color to another, you're in charge of how quickly that or slowly that happens just by the amount of gravity you supply. Anyway, this is just a very traditional old school graded wash where you start with this bead of water, you pull it down the page. Traditionally, in Beaux-Arts tradition, you didn't even touch the brush to the paper, you just touched it to that bead of water and pulled it down. I'm not quite that careful, but I tried to be relatively true to the technique. You could just end up with the most seamless, smooth, unstreaky washes this way. Even very large ones are comparatively easy to do. Oh, as far as a brush, I'm using one of my signature brushes, the Thomas W. Schaller mop brushes by Neef, Series 118. They come in a whole variety of sizes. They're synthetic, but they're modern synthetic, meaning they're beautifully designed to behave much the way a natural hair brush would, but no sables or squirrels were harmed in the production of these brushes. So here, this very wet wash, I'm dropping in a little bit of red in the center, orange, and now more near the bottom, I'm dropping in some of this violet. As far as colors that I used, I started off with a Holbein Naples yellow, then a Daniel Smith French ochre, a little bit of Mayan orange, just a tiny bit Daniel Smith, and at the bottom here, this is an imperial purple or a mineral violet, I think, by Holbein. Doesn't matter, just a bit of violet to try to anchor the bottom of the sky. It's not, the color's not important, obviously it is, but for me it's really a question of value more than color. I want to make sure I get the luminosity, the light, and the values correct. I like the overall look of this so far. I do worry I probably haven't gone quite dark enough, but maybe that's okay. Overall softer effect. I can sometimes be a little heavy-handed with my values, and I definitely don't want to be that in this painting, so maybe I'll try to be happy with just an overall softer, narrower color and value range. Colors, though, I like. I think it's just what I had in mind. Again, not 100% convinced that I nailed the values, but I may have done. It's always best to try to get the values correct or pretty close the first time in watercolor, because, yeah, you can go back in and revisit, glaze over. I do it all the time, but it never looks quite as fresh or as fluid as it does when you can just nail those values with one single wash. In my more traditional classical or Beaux-Arts training, that's not what we did. We built up values with very thin, very pale washes, one after the other after the other. To get to this value, which is fairly light, it could take 5, 6, 8 washes. It's not an invalid way to paint, but it tests the patience of the artist and also the capacity of the actual paper you're painting on to be able to handle that many washes, which brings me back to the topic of sizing. Old paper with loads of sizing could handle way more washes than most modern watercolor paper can. So you do have to bear that in mind. This is still quite wet, so I'm playing around by dropping a little bit more value just at the base of the sky. If I keep this up, I still have a chance to completely ruin it, so yay me. What I want to do before this dries is connect it to a wash over the foreground, maintaining a lot of light in here, less so as it gets down here. So I'll go back to my larger mop. This is another in the same series, but a larger one. They range from sizes, these brushes, that is, from about a 5.0 to up to a number 8. This is a number 2, so a fairly mid-sized mop brush, but it holds lots of water. The advantage of a brush holding a lot of water, of course, is you can do a much wider area before you have to go back to re-wet the brush in your palette, so therefore you can do them more quickly, more fluidly, and the chances of you ending up with a streaky result are much less, so that's good. So I'm just pulling here and there this wet sky wash down into the foreground. Should be all right. It's pretty light, but I want to be sure I maintain some bits of white in this foreground, but not too much. So this is just some raw umber, yellow ochre, just some, I don't want to say generic, but just some fairly non-aggressive warm tones. Again, up in this area, I want to save some edges and some pure whites to connect the whites I'm going to save in the temple to the foreground, so everything in the painting looks connected and nothing looks added on or unconsidered. So I'm painting around some things and over some others. It's not really all that planned out. It's fairly intuitive, just sort of on the fly what I'm doing. But looks okay. I think the thing for me to do now, as always, is to take a deep breath and then just tone out the entire bottom of the painting. A couple ways to do that. You could do it with a big wet brush, but also another way is I have these really nice Holbein mist bottles that you can, obviously a quick way to just add some water. So here you can see if I miss that area, I can, if I'm careful, I can maintain some of the edges and then I can obscure some of the others. Then I can just add water. And then into that water, this is a bit more of the yellow ochre and the yellow tonality I had in the sky. So some Naples and yellow ochre there. And that doesn't kill all the light, but it knocks it back a bit. It's generally never a great idea to have too much pure white or your darkest darks or your lightest lights going off the edges of the paper. Here you can see it looks like I accidentally dropped in some of that yellow tone into my beautiful violet sky. Oh well. But I'm going to just tilt it up, give it a little gravity, let some of that extraneous fluid run so I don't end up with any big blossoms. Then I'll take the smaller mop and I'll reintroduce some of that violet gray back into the base of the sky here. And then while I'm at it, I'll just let it run down, add a little bit more gravity, let it run down here and there. This is a great way to add just visual connections to everything. So this isn't painting things so much, it's just general painting to add color and shape connectivity from all the areas of the painting, so it all hopefully when done looks unified. It's very soft light, so there's not going to be any really deep cast shadows. I mean, you could do them anyway, but I think they would look a little out of place. So I think there will be shadows, but they'd be softer and less defined. Anyway, all's fine. This is just the initial washes to what I like to say, carve the light. Watercolor is unique in the sense that in most painting medias, oil, acrylics often, that other more opaque mediums, you add the light. I get asked a lot, how do you paint the light in your watercolors? And smartass that I am, the answer is, well, I don't. The light is painted by the paper, by the light, the white of the paper itself. So the light is already painted. What we do in this medium is paint the shadows and the shades that give the light character and presence. So I'm not painting light, I'm painting shadows. I'm revealing the light. So it's opposite. Watercolor is opposite world. One of the many reasons I love it so much. So a lot of what we do in watercolor is what often would be described in painting lingo as negative shape painting. We paint around light objects to reveal them. So these begin to develop a presence not because we've painted them or how we've painted them, but because we haven't painted them at all. Often the strength of a watercolor rests in what we don't paint as much as what we do paint. All right, so because of that, because the light of the painting really is already painted and we're just revealing it, I work my paintings up from the lightest lights to the darkest darks, most often. I'm looking for a slightly smaller brush. This is a 00, same series. So the darkest darks are usually the last things to happen. I start with the lightest midtones, work into the darker midtones. Often these are my wet and wet, more impressionistic, looser, less edge-based bits of the painting. As things begin to dry and get a little closer to the end, more saturation occurs, more edges begin to appear, and the darkest darks are often the bits of the painting that have the hardest edges and the most saturation. Not always. I can think of 100 exceptions, but generally that is true. So peeking through here, you can see a bit of the sky. I just want to paint that in before I forget. It's important, although a bit minor. It's a little darker than I wanted, but that's an easy fix. When you work quite wet like this and you build up a bead of paint and you're afraid because you're working on a tilt that it's going to run down, take a brush just and a paper towel, take out a lot of the moisture and just touch it to the end of that bead and it'll siphon up into the brush and save yourself a lot of headaches that you might have otherwise. So next stages are very dependent on how dry the paper is. Logically, I'd start delineating the temple. As I said, in my little sketch, where'd it go? I want to make the upper portions of this temple a little darker, then grade it down into light. But to do that, I want to maintain an edge. So the sky behind has to be dry enough, and I think it is, so that I could start to do that. Often for elements of architecture, flat brushes come in very handy. Not always absolutely necessary, but they just sometimes make your life easier. I didn't used to use flat brushes at all, but I've taken to loving them the last few years because I've really developed a fondness for dry brush technique, which means that thing that happens when you just drag the brush across the page and lift it and you get these very characterful aerated marks. That said, I don't want too much of that here. Also, it's easier with a flat brush to cut in around corners and edges and that sort of thing if you need to do that. Color here, I'm using a little bit of the violet that I was already using, but I'm introducing some darker warm. This is a Van Dyke brown. So I think I'm just experimenting, but playing around with the top of this temple, how dark it wants to be against the sky. I don't think it needs to approach black, but it wants to be dark enough. So this warmish brown, I think, is probably the way to go. Here and there into that, because this is marble, and even though it's ancient, it still looks pretty darn good, or it did when I was there, and I'm sure it looks even better now that it's been cleaned. Marble also often in its shade and shadow areas picks up a bit of blue or even bluish green. So I'm going to modify this brown with some blues, some cobalt blues, as I said earlier, and maybe here and there a little teal, just because I love this color. I don't want to get too fussy about it, but that brown and teal against the yellows, very pleasing complement, a little bit more sophisticated than just the purple yellow. I'm proceeding with caution, as you can see here, because I don't want to go too dark, but I don't want it to be too light, so just figuring it out as I go. The undersides of these big stone lintels, I'm sure I'll come back in and go a bit darker on them, but I don't want this to look like, oddly enough, I don't want it to look too much like an architectural drawing or rendering or technical drawing. So I don't want to be too reliant on edges and utter precision, so I can get away with some of these softer edges, I think, even in the architectural elements. And when I'm more nearly done, I'll come back and add any sort of specificity or crispness that I think it may need, or harder edges if I need them. I may not. The forms of these are all pretty clear. It's pretty simple to see what's going on. Stupidly, I forgot, I just painted this area of sky, so it's not dry yet. So yeah, painting up next to it is going to cause me a little bit of grief that I could have avoided, but it's such a small area. I think it'll be dry enough in just a moment, so I'm going to work elsewhere while that finishes drying, and hopefully this will still be wet enough to manipulate. So I'm using just a combination of these smaller mop brushes and then these mid to small size flats. Here, because I want to maintain light at the bottom of the columns, I'm going to use this 1/8 inch Tintoretto flat and then take that dark tone at the top of the column, swipe it down in a dry brush technique so that it sort of implies detail and texture, but it quickly resolves into just pure light at the bottom, and that's exactly what I want. Can't do that without using a flat brush. I can't, not as easily or organically. Still pretty wet. I can darken up the top if I think I need to, which I do. This column's slightly more forward, so I'm going to use a slightly larger 1/2 inch flat Escoda brush and do the same thing here. Just this mid-tone brown, fluid wash, but not as much water. So yeah, so it just resolves into pure light at the bottom. neglect using your fingers to feather out tones to make them more the way you want. Yeah, it's all right. I don't know that I need to save these whites on these column capitals. Maybe just a glint is enough. Again, all that specificity is more akin to a more technical architectural drawing. And obviously there's some elements of that here, but I do not want to overdo it. I want this thing to look as painterly and romantic as I'm able to do it. Just using blue grays, some cobalt with some violet that just snuck in, and then some deeper browns. So just a fairly subtle but a warm, cool toggle. Because we really only paint darks in watercolor, I just think we owe it to ourselves to think about the darks we use. Think about letting your dog get too near your palette because there's a dog hair. Oh dear. Well, it'll be all right. I'll just ignore it. You do well to think about, yes, there I got it. To think about the, my dog sheds like crazy, and that's adorable, but you think about the luminosity of your darks. I think about it all the time. So your shades and shadows do not just have to be dull, gray, neutral, undistinguished areas. They can have a lot of light, color, luminosity within them. Yeah, okay, we'll see. I still like my idea. Not 100% sure it's gonna work, but we'll just carry on and hope for the best. If you're like me, you see in your mind the way you want your painting to look. My little sketches I do really help me make that real. But there's always the chance that it's just not gonna quite pan out in the final. However, if you don't have any plan at all, the odds are much less that it's gonna work out. So I'm a big fan of planning your paintings before you start, but then also allowing, well, being aware that you can only plan so far, and watercolor up after a certain point is going to do what it wants to do, and you have to let that happen. So planning is good, but improvisation is inevitable. Yes, I will paint this wall behind. You could make an argument that I could have done that all at once, but I chose not to, obviously. I think I still want a little delineation between what's behind and what's forward, so I think those will be a little bit lighter. Could have painted them sooner, but I didn't, and don't think it'll matter all that much in the long run. So these columns in the back, I want a similar treatment, but just a little less saturation. The way to imply things are farther away is to make them lighter in value, which makes sense. Softer in focus, which means less hard edges, less detail, less value, less saturation. It doesn't mean you have to do that. It's just the easiest way to make something look farther away than something else. It's obvious, but I'm always taken with the fact that we're painting and drawing on flat, two-dimensional surfaces. We only have height and width to play with, so whatever we can do to play around with this sense of 3 dimensions is at least worth thinking about, even if you paint in a completely abstract way. It's just a way to inject a lot of narrative and feeling into your work. Yeah, okay. It's starting to take shape. So obviously, as you work on one part of the painting, the other parts that you may have put some initial washes on begin to dry. So you may be able to go back and revisit them. I think it's a little soon for me to go back and paint these walls behind yet until this sets up just a bit more. This is not dry, but the shine of the wet paper's gone away. It's still a bit rippled, so it means it's not 100% dry, but I think it's dry enough that I could start to flesh that out. I'm a bit frustrated because the lower parts of the sky, I really needed them to be a bit darker than they are. So I'm a little grumpy that I didn't quite nail that value. But that's okay. It's not a problem, it's an opportunity. One of my least favorite sayings, even though it's true. So what I'm going to do is just with a flat brush, as you can see, I'm just going to reintroduce a little bit of value to the base of the sky, left and right. Dry brush it up so it feathers out. And even though I didn't intend to, I think I'm going to drop some distant greens, some olive greens in there because I do want to work some of those colors down here. And I think that'll be a way to make that all connect. Here I can probably just feather with my thumb or finger that wettish wash to make it a little smoother. Or I could mist it to add a little water. And then I'm going to take some of this olive green. It's a Daniel Smith serpentine green. Very beautiful mineral-based green, but I'm going to modify it in the palette, which I normally don't do. But I just wanted a very subtle green, so I'm mixing some Van Dyke brown into it to make it even more olive, a little more subtle. I'm gonna drop this tonality into the bottom of the sky. I don't want it to look figural, or by that I mean look like anything, but just to sort of add value, but to suggest the coloration of distant hills, trees, and that sort of thing. Then I'm going to begin to pull some of those green, olive green tones down into the foreground. And maybe my mistake on the sky would actually end up being a bit of an opportunity. Don't you hate it when cliches are true? Yeah, I think that's all right, not bad. All right, this has to stay wet, so I have to work fairly quickly, but I want to do something similar on the left side or the right side. So I could either do it now and try to keep both sides moving, or I could just work a bit over on this side, do a similar treatment there. I think that's the way to go. I'll become a little less specific about these shapes as they come down. By that I mean I'll just use a flat brush to scrape in some shapes in and around some of these vague architectural antiquities I've implied here in the foreground. So really, I hope you can understand what I'm trying to do here is not paint things. I'm just trying to paint values that are going to help make this whole painting work. There's not a lot of dark values. The only darks are going to be a little bit in this band and these little jewels of dark at the top. So the darkest darks in this painting are not very dark, but they all have to happen in this band. This is all fairly mid-tone at the bottom, so here, whatever dark tones I'm going to use are pretty critical. And yes, quickly as I get further down toward the foreground, I'm adding a bit more water so that even that pale green is less intense. It's all pretty subtle stuff. But that works-ish. It more or less works. Here and there, just in this band, I'm going to drop in some deeper browns, this Van Dyke brown, just to add not color so much, but value. To help anchor this band throughout the whole painting. Now you might be asking yourselves, but all this attention to these things, is that not going to detract attention from this? Not so. I don't think so, because I'm going to do a similar treatment to the top of the temple as it begins to dry more, and I think the dominant values will be up there for the most part. These I hope will just read as supplemental, helpful, but not the main story. A few blues here and there on the sides of these marble bits. Yeah, anyway, it's all pretty subtle stuff, so nothing to worry about. So, as I said, I'm going to then come back onto the right side, do somewhat of a similar treatment down here. And of course, I think you can see that all the time I'm spending here will allow all this, hopefully, to be dry enough that I could go back and revisit. So I was pretty lucky on the left side, being able to add some additional tone and value without running another huge wet wash. So I'll just try to be hopeful that I'll be as lucky over here. What I don't want is this harsh line. I want just a smoother transition up into the sky that already exists. So that's a little bit dodgy of a way to do it, but it can sometimes work. And a little mist should soften up the edge, and everything should be fine. Okay, so again, I'm going to drop in a little bit of this serpentine green that I leavened with a little bit of Van Dyke brown. And again, the intent is just to suggest distant hills, trees, and greenery without actually painting them. And then while this is still quite wet, I'm going to drag it down into the landscape to start implying some of the foreground. And again, I'm not focusing on painting things so much as I am on adding this band of value through the middle. I'm not concentrating on being representational is what I mean. I'm thinking about values more than I am about representation or specific rendering of objects, because bear in mind, I don't know what's really here. I just invented it all. I just added shapes that I hoped would make the painting look good. Okay. Again, the serpentine green, yes, but into it I'm dropping some of this Van Dyke brown and bits of blue here and there as needed. Again, it's a very soft, light effect I'm after, so I'm trying to steer away from really sharp cast shadows. Even with no light or practically very, very low light, there'd be a certain amount of shadowing, but I want to keep it to a minimum. Again, not to be accurate or meteorologically accurate, but just to tell the story of the painting that I'm trying to tell, which is very memory-like, very sort of dream-like, and intentionally kind of ghosty. Not in a spooky way, I hope, but in a compelling way that sort of feels like what it is, a memory. And so what I mean is, if I start relying on a bright blue sky and really sharp edge shadows and people crawling all around it, it starts looking more like a touristy, cliche version of a scene paintings, and I really don't. I want to steer a little bit clear of that. So here, yeah, the implication of things is good. I think it works better on this side. It's starting to look a little specific over here. Not tragic, but I want to loosen up so it looks a little fuzzier and more impressionistic. So to that end, I'll go with a slightly larger brush, 1/2 inch, quicker brush marks to get a lot of these aerated skip dry brush marks that I love. So things, you know, looks like something, but you can't really tell what, and that's what I want. Using a brush that's synthetic is helpful usually. It's not a synthetic brush, synthetic bristles. But it's helpful doing dry brush because it runs out of water a little quicker and you can get these scrapey marks a little more quickly. This is good, but I think it looks a little busy and a little too active. So while it's still a little wet, I'm gonna mist parts of the foreground. Just knock back some of that specificity and some of those edges. Keep it ghostier and dreamier. Yes, that's better. It is not 100% done here, but I think the big elements are in, and what that helps me do is gauge how dark then I need to go up here. What do I need to compete with to make sure that all this reads together as one big center of focus, with this being more the star of the show. So what I've done up here a little while ago is dry enough that I can go back in and paint these walls behind. I think I am going to suggest a soft light coming from right to left so that the sides of all these things will get subtly or gently shaded a little bit. It'll just give it some form and dimension that it's lacking now. So what I'm using here is 1/2 inch flat and just some raw umber, a warm brown, scraping it down, letting it fade out to light. be a little bit specific about this corner for some reason. I think that will be helpful. Yes, I want to save as much light as I can. I want to try, it's a bit difficult, but to make this marble structure look almost illuminated from within. So the less I paint it, the better. But it needs a little bit of paint, but probably much less than I think. The forms are fairly simple and easy to understand, so they really just don't need all that much. Raw umber, this is cobalt blue, just to complement here and there. Just slightly popping out the edges. I'm gonna leave this edge white. I think that's the way to go. I can always knock it back later if it's not, but I think it is. You can always take away light, but it's pretty hard to add it once you've eaten it away. All right. Mostly dry-ish. Way in the distance, I'll add a little character to this, but I want to make it look far away, of course, so try to keep the detail and the saturation and values to a minimum. I love to paint, and for me, almost the hardest thing to do is just to do less rather than more. To put my paintbrush down sometimes. Dropped in a little teal as an experiment. It's a little aggressive, but I love that violet teal dialogue, so it may be all right. Let's soften it a little. This really isn't as dry as I thought it would be at this point. So I hate using it, but I'm going to just hit this with a hairdryer for a second. I don't like using hair dryers because I paint so wet and I use this very textured paper. The paint sinks down into the little valleys, and then if it's very wet and you hit it with the hair dryer, the hot air blows all the pigment out of the little valleys of your paper, and It ends up drying very flat and you can end up with streaks. And I also just hate the sound of a hairdryer. But anyway, for little areas like this, it's not, there's no real downside. You can kind of almost burn the paper and it can look a little overly flat and dry sometimes. So here I'm using a combination of the Van Dyke brown, some of this cobalt teal, and just experimenting with some of these darker shadow shade tonalities, just dusky warms and cools. Trying to tread a line between sort of impressionistic, somewhat poetic painting, I hope, and then more technical painting, sort of a mix of the two that I hope I can manage. I don't want it to look too messy and loose, but I definitely don't want it to look too tight. And yeah, I think I'm doing all right. You have to feel confident even if you're not. And I'm oddly adamant about using this teal color. I just think in the end, it sings beautifully off those violets and the yellows. So there's so little color in this painting. I think it's the way to go with this dark, ancient, shady marble. And especially with this low lighting condition that we have. Here and there, I'm allowing myself to be a little more specific. I think because there's a lack of specificity generally, that I think it'll be okay if there's just a little bit of it. It's another nice contrast you can play around with. So teal, Van Dyke, brown. Kind of avoiding the blues. I think the teal works a little better. The blues were beginning to dry a little bit gray, overly gray looking. Yeah, okay. Now here at the bottoms of the columns, do I need to add any shadowing or do I just want the light to just bleach out all the detail? I'm tempted to add just a little, but so when I say that, it means I'm probably going to, but I really think less is definitely more. Just a slight hint, maybe. And I'm using yellow ochre, keeping it very pale. Yeah, it's okay. Right. So now I think the overall value balance is far better in the painting. You've got this nice triad of darks from here to here to here. A little bit more work down here, I think, and maybe we'll just stop and assess, maybe call it a day. It's all intended just to be a quick impressionistic sketch after all. So here I'm just using a raw umber, soft brown, not too light, no, not too dark, but not a bright color, just a nice mid-tone, warm. And what I'm doing is just trying to feather the values down so they don't look isolated, everything looks connected as much as possible. And I do think it's a pretty nice toggle of light from mid-tone into the lights, centering around here and then connecting up to the sky. Not so bad at all. Here with the flat brush, I'm adding, trying to be minimal about it, but just little bits of yellow ochre, little bits of variation in the stone. I'm eating away some of the white, so I have to be careful. I think there's enough of it that I can afford to do that, but this can go overboard really quick, and then you find you've killed a lot of your light. Don't want to do that. I think that's enough of that. Now what I want to do is I'm going to go with a larger, a 1 inch or 3/4 inch Escoda versatile brush. And I'm going to do some dry brush painting up one side and the other, just to help emphasize the verticality of the whole painting and also squeeze the lights in a little tighter in the center. One other little thing, I think I need a little bit more of this soft green on this side of the painting. So again, the larger flat brush, I'm going to use a burnt sienna light, so an earthy, warm tone with this larger flat brush, and paint up from the bottom in these intentional dry brush marks that I leave a little aeration in between here and there. And what this does is it adds a little tone as if it's a wash, but it's not like a smooth, consistent wash. It leaves bits of air showing through here and there. It helps to anchor the painting, connect a lot of these different shapes, more aggressively center the vertical story, and adds, I hope, some sort of dreamlike obscurity to the foreground. Yeah, I like that. As in all techniques, it can look good, but it can also go overboard, so a little can go a long way. While that's still wet, I'll use that as an opportunity to drop in a little more of the olive tone, but in the wet, so it runs, so it looks, you know, obviously very fluid. Just let it run downhill. Again, more to help emphasize the vertical story. And as a way to introduce just a little bit more interest, texture, and value here to this band. This is Van Dyke Brown. But wet and wet, so they don't have hard edges. These are just soft. I'm allowing it to run wet and wet. I think the value story there is pretty good, and I don't want to do anything to make it too strong. Only thing, the values up here look to me a little wanting. They're pretty much where I wanted them to be, but I think they could be just a little stronger. So just at the very tops, this is more of the deep, warm. I'll just add some character marks, similar to what I did here, but in the vertical axis. Some dry brush marks with an 1/8 inch flat Van Dyke Brown. So I think for the most part, everybody, that is it. I'm going to let this begin to dry. I may make a few little tweaks and adjustments here and there, but for the most part, what I've tried to paint for you is recreating a memory from about 40 years ago of the Temple of Epicurius Apollo in Bassae, Greece, on the Peloponnesian Peninsula. And yeah, it's just a walk back through memory lane for me. And then as a way to discuss developing sketches from your past or from your present or from whenever. There's no reason to ever run out of things to paint. There's always your imagination, your memory, or pure invention. But thank you all for your time. I will post this when it's dry and 100% complete. But thanks for watching, and happy painting. See you soon.